Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to make an expanding laptop backpack. The finished bag measures in at 16 by 12 with a 6-inch depth, and when you zip it up, it shrinks down to a 2-inch depth, making it super versatile. You can use this for a standard laptop case or expand it into a full-blown backpack. And this project is on the more technical side, but following the step-by-step process in this video will overall take your sewing to that next level. But with all that being said, if you are new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're gonna wanna grab 1.5 yards for your main fabric, and I recommend grabbing a canvas, denim, or twill. These are nice heavy duty fabrics and they're very easy to work with. I'm actually gonna be using a few different fabrics. I'm gonna be using upholstery fabric, a wax fabric, and a hiking bag fabric. All these are totally different, but I wanna show that you can use a variety of fabrics and it doesn't just have to be canvas, denim, or twill. I just usually recommend those because they're very easy to work with if you're new to sewing. You'll need 1.5 yards for your secondary layer, and this is gonna be your lining. So I recommend grabbing a lighter weight cotton or polyester, something that's definitely lighter weight because we're gonna be sewing a lot of layers together, and at the end it can get pretty bulky. You'll need a 1/2 yard for your laptop fabric, and this is gonna be a very thin, soft material. Again, you want this on the thinner side, but you do want it to be lighter weight and kind of fuzzy so you can slide your laptop in the back case and it's protected. You'll need 3 zippers, one 18-inch, one 48-inch, and one 60-inch. And I'm actually gonna be using a zipper roll. This is way easier to get these bigger size zippers, but you can buy your zippers. It might be a little bit harder locating a 60-inch zipper and having a match all the way through. But I'm gonna be using the roll, so if you wanna see how I do that, we'll get to that later on. You'll need 1 to 2 yards of 1-inch webbing, and this is gonna be used in the straps. You can actually do all the straps out of the webbing, or you can make the straps that I'm gonna be showing in the video. So that's why there's a range for the amount of webbing to use. And going along with the width of that webbing, you'll need 2 lobster clasps, 2 strap adjusters, and 2 D-rings. You'll want all of these to be 1-inch width to match the width of your webbing. But if you are using a wider webbing, just make sure you grab hardware that's gonna match the width of your webbing. You'll need a 4 by 10-inch piece of plastic, and this is gonna be used as a support to keep the main bag open. And you can actually cut this out of a school folder or any small thin piece of plastic around the house. And this is totally optional, but we'll get to that later on when we start making the bag. You'll need about a 1/4 yard of 1/2 inch to a 1/4 inch foam. This will also be used for the straps, but if you're making your straps all out of webbing, you don't need the foam. You'll need 2 button snaps, and I'm gonna be using magnetic. I've been using these on a lot of projects. They're super fun to use and really easy to install. But feel free to use any snap closure that matches the style you're going for. And lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is print it out and you're ready to go. And after you print it out, it's best to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And after you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern taped together, it's time to move into cutting.
After taping your pattern together, it should look like this. And for the best results, make sure your printer is aligned. And after cutting out your pattern pieces, you should end up with 4 main strap panels cut out of your main fabric, 1 front pocket flap panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold, 1 inside plastic cover panel cut out of your lining on the fold, 2 back side panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your lining, 2 main bottom side panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your lining, 2 main top side panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your lining, also cut on the fold, 4 main front and back pocket panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your lining, 6 main front and back panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric, 2 cut out of your lining, and 2 cut out of your laptop fabric. After cutting all your panels, it's time to move into construction. Starting with the main front and back pocket panel, grab all the panels, place the right sides together, add a few pins, line up the top edge, and we're gonna stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And repeat the stitch for the opposite set of pocket panels. After stitching, flip the wrong sides together, lining up the top edge, pin the edge into alignment, and we're gonna add a top stitch. I'm going to be using an edge presser foot to get a nice straight even top stitch, and this will also help me keep a uniform top stitch throughout the bag. And my top stitch is going to be about a 1/4 inch away from that edge, but feel free to use whatever depth top stitch you would like. And you can move those panels off to the side and grab your front pocket flap panels. Flip the panel open and fold it in half with the right sides together, and we're going to stitch both of the side edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Leave the top edge open and we're going to flip the right sides out. Try to poke the corners out as best as possible, and we're going to add a top stitch to that entire edge. Take your time and try to make this as neat as possible because it's going to be on the front and center of your bag. Another good technique is matching the thread with your fabric. Next, we're going to serge the top edge. I'm using a fabric that's fraying a lot. This step is totally optional, but it is very helpful if you're using a fabric that is fraying a lot. It just makes it a lot easier to sew in the long run. And if you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch instead. And I highly recommend getting in the habit of doing this because overall, it makes for a more quality and better looking bag. Lay your pattern down, grab your pattern piece, and we're going to use it to mark out our button placement. And realistically, you can put them wherever you want, but just try to make them as even as possible to the outside edge. After marking, cut or punch out your holes. And I'm using a magnetic snap. The side I'd like to start with is the thinner side for the top flat panel. Slide both the snaps into your holes from the bottom of your flat panel. Flip the panel right side up and grab the back end of your snaps. Secure the snaps onto the back of the magnets. And once everything is lined up, you can either press, use pliers, or even a hammer die to fully tighten and secure these closures down. And it's really that simple to add these magnetic snaps to your bag. Moving on, grab your main front back panel. You'll only need one of your main fabric panels. Slide the others off to the side, grab your pocket panel, place it on the right side, lining it up on the bottom. Pin all the layers together, grab your completed flat panel, place it directly above the pocket, flip it over horizontally so the right sides are touching, and we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, attaching that flap to the main panel. Try to keep the flap as even in the middle as possible. Flip the flap down. If you're using a bulky fabric, I recommend adding a few pins, and then next we're going to add a top stitch. Again, take your time and make this as neat as possible. From here, we're going to grab one of our lining panels, grab the main front panel, place it directly on top of your lining with wrong sides together, and we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge as close as we can to the outside edge. You can use a serger or a straight stitch. It's totally up to you. I'm using a serger because my lining is fraying a lot. And we are going to be working with a lot of layers throughout this project, so it's really nice to consolidate them down into one layer. After stitching, do a quick check to make sure all the layers got stitched together. And from here, we're going to add the bottom part of our magnetic snap. The easiest way to do this is fold the flap down and mark where the top snaps land. When you have your markings, cut or punch out your holes. Grab the opposite end of your magnetic snap or your other snap you're using. Place it in your holes from the right side of your fabric. Add the back caps and press both of your snaps into position. After pressing, I always like to do a quick check to make sure that the pocket works good and everything lines up correctly. If everything checks out, you can move the main panel off to the side and grab our inside plastic cover panel. Just like the flat panel, we're going to fold it in half with the right sides together and stitch both of the side edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Try to make the stitches as even as possible, and once the stitches are complete, flip the right sides out. Next, we're going to add our plastic insert. This is done by sliding it in through the top opening. Slide it all the way down to the bottom of your panel, and you should have about a 2-inch gap. To make it easier, we're going to stitch that top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you can either stitch or serge. And if you don't want to add the divider, you can totally skip this step. Grab your main panel, flip the lining up, and we're going to stitch that complete plastic cover to the bottom edge of our front panel. You want to make sure you have this panel directly lined up on the bottom edge and stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. And again, this step is optional. It's going to give you a solid plastic bottom when you're using that main bag opening. The size of the flap can also be adjusted to the curve, but the thing is you really want to make sure that you don't go past the outside edges because it makes it harder to sew the panels together in the end. Moving on, grab the opposite main back main fabric and one of your laptop fabric layers. With these 2 layers flat, we're going to place the wrong sides together. Grab the opposite pocket panel, line it up on the bottom like we did the front panel. Add a couple pins to keep all the layers lined up, and we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge as close as we can to the edge. I'm using a serger just like I did the front panel. This is going to reduce the amount of layers. I highly recommend trying this technique if you have a serger. If you don't, it's also good to use a zigzag stitch. Double check, make sure all the layers got sewn together, slide this panel off to the side, and grab your main strap panels. As you can see, the pattern's labeled wrong, but place the right sides together, creating 2 separate straps, and we're going to sew the edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving the top edge unstitched. And definitely take your time going around the curves because you want that to be as even as possible for a nice looking strap. And for the best results, I recommend practicing sewing curves. After stitching, we're going to add our foam inserts, and these are going to be cut smaller than the actual stitch itself. You want these inserts to be on the inside of your stitch. You can use a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch foam. I recommend staying in that threshold because it does get bulky. So what I do is sew the foam insert to the seam allowance on the front tip. This is going to keep that foam into position while you're pulling the right sides out. From here, we're going to start at the inside and push everything out towards the outside. eventually working the bottom of that strap to the top opening. Once you have the bottom to the opening, you can grab it and pull the rest out very easily. As far as the length goes, I like to cut mine longer, fold the top back, and trim them. You want to leave about 2 inches of no foam at the top of your strap. To secure everything into place, we're going to serge the top edge. You can serge or just use a regular straight stitch. Next, we're going to add a stitch directly down the center of our straps. This is going to push the foam off to the side, overall giving the strap a fuller effect. And it's also going to keep that foam insert on the inside from moving around. Grab your pattern piece, cut out your webbing placement. We're going to place it directly on the strap at the bottom, lining it up in the center. Mark out the placement with chalk. Just make sure that both of them are even to one another. Grab your webbing, and we're using a 1-inch webbing. Cut 2 6-inch strips. You'll need both of your strap adjusters. And we're going to slide the strips of webbing into the top 2 openings of your strap adjuster, starting with the outside opening and working it back through the inside opening. Repeat this for the other strap, and we're going to add it directly on our marked placement. The webbing from the top opening is going to roll over, creating a nice clean edge at the top, and we're going to add a box stitch all the way around the outside edge. This can be tricky with all the bulk, so just take your time and use a heavier weight needle if needed. And like always, repeat this for the opposite strap. Finishing off the straps, we're going to cut 2 2-foot strips of webbing. Grab our lobster clasp, and you can either use plastic or metal. Just make sure the openings match the width of your webbing. Feed the webbing through the opening, and we're going to roll the end over just like we did in the previous step to hide the raw edge of the webbing. When you have the end folded, add a nice tack stitch. These ends will take a lot of stress, so definitely make sure you tack stitch it down good. And to complete our straps, we're going to take our bottom strap, feed it through our strap adjuster from the outside opening, back down through the inside opening. Just like the previous step, we're going to roll that webbing end over twice and add a tack stitch. Repeat this process for the other side, and your straps are complete. And I do recommend a little bit more webbing to make these extra long, but you can adjust these easily with the webbing you have on, or you can actually make these longer for an overall longer strap. Grab your assembled main back panel and your pattern piece. We're going to place a pattern piece on top and mark out our strap placement on both the top and the bottom. Line your completed straps up on the top. Cut 2 5-inch strips of your 1-inch webbing, and we're going to feed them through your D-rings. Do this for both of your webbing strips. Add the strips to the bottom markings with about a 1/2 inch of the webbing hanging off the edge. Pin the straps and the webbing into position and stitch as close as you can to the outside edge, just enough to lock everything down. Just make sure all your straps are even on both sides of your panel. I think it's best to clip everything down and actually try this panel on to make sure it's the right size before you actually move on to the next step. After testing, move the straps to the inside of the pocket. Moving on, grab the back side panels. Cut your zipper to 15.75 inches. Lay your lining panel flat with right sides up. Place your zipper on top of your lining panel and place the right side of your main fabric on the right side of your zipper. With the edges lined up, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, flip the panels to the opposite end of the zipper in the same order, lining, zipper, and then main panel with the right sides together. Stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, make sure that zipper train is on the inside of your panel. Flip the right sides out and add a top stitch to both of the new seams. Take your time with these top stitches. You are going to be going over a zipper. Hand cranking the machine over the zipper really works good and helps prevent breaking needles. Just like we did with the main panel, we're going to serge these layers together. This step is optional. It will be easier in the long run, but we're going to serge both of the sides, avoiding the zipper. Working with all these layers, it gets really tricky trying to keep it organized, so anything that helps just a little bit really goes a long way, and that's why I really recommend serging. Or even using a zigzag stitch. Place the backside panel off to the side and grab your main top side panels. Lay the panels out flat, parallel to one another, and grab your zipper that is just a little bit longer than the panel. Place the right sides together on the main fabric and then the lining over top, sandwiching the zipper in between the lining and the main fabric. Make sure that zipper is centered in the panel and hangs off both of the side edges about 1 inch on each side. With both of the panels sewn to the zipper, we're going to flip both the wrong sides together, lining up the top zipper edge, and from here we're going to add a top stitch. This is a really good panel to have the edge presser foot. It's a long stitch, and those long stitches can get tricky, so it's nice to have that guide to keep everything even as I'm sewing. But either way, after stitching, set that panel off to the side and grab our main bottom side panel. Using the guides on our pattern, we're going to mark the same guides out on our main fabric and cut a 60 to 64 inch zipper. And yes, this is a super long zipper, and we're going to place the end of that zipper on those markings with the right sides together. Make sure the ends stick off the edge about 1/2 inch, and it's even on both of the sides. Once everything is lined up and even, we're going to stitch both of those zipper sides down, just on the areas we marked. From here, we're going to roll the zipper sides flat with the right sides up and add a top stitch. It can be tricky to get that close to the zipper, so I recommend using a narrow zipper foot to get nice and close to that zipper. If you're also using a zipper roll, from here you can add on your zipper train, but don't zip it too far. Grab your complete main top side panel, lay it flat with the right sides up, and we're going to add our complete main bottom side panel to the edge. Grab the main bottom side panel lining and place it on the opposite side, sandwiching the main top in between both of the layers. Pin it together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'll definitely want to take your time and possibly hand crank over a few of these zippers. It can get pretty tricky, but going slow and being cautious around those zippers will give you perfect results. Grab the opposite end of both top and bottom panels, place the linings together, and place the main fabric right sides together, sandwiching the top side panel in between the bottom side panels. With all the edges lined up, pin the layers together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the top edge. And you really want to make sure you have all the side edges lined up evenly. Flip the outer right side layer out flat, and I like to just double check to make sure that all the zippers got included and also all the layers. Just like the back side, we're going to top stitch both of the new side seams. And I like to actually jump the zipper in the center of the bottom panel. It's just too much for this machine to handle, so I jump it and just start the stitch on the opposite side. If you feel confident in going over it, you can totally do that, but once the zipper is pointing up, I typically jump it. The next step, again, is optional. We're going to be serging both of the side edges on both sides. If you choose to do this step, just jump both of your diagonal zippers. You don't want to accidentally cut those or sew those to the wrong portion of the panel. This serge is also going to help us actually connect our zipper a little bit easier once we get to that next step. And that's exactly what we're doing next. We're attaching the rest of the zipper all the way around the side edges. So whatever side the zipper pops out on, that's the side for that zipper, and we're going all the way around, and we're actually going to go back past over it about 2 to 4 inches depending on how long you cut your zipper. The biggest thing you want to keep in mind is that you want these to be perfectly even on both sides, or else your zipper train is not going to run correctly. Technically, sewing them on the diagonal already lined them up, but this is also nice just to keep in mind as you're sewing and ending your stitch. Once you decided where you're going to end it, you're going to turn that zipper off so it kind of curves right off the side edge, and then you're going to tack stitch back and forth to really lock that into position. After finishing up that first side, we're going to mark exactly where it ends on the opposite side. You don't have to do this marking if you're confident in where your zipper is going to end, but overall it is really helpful to have a visual so you don't accidentally sew past that point and make your zippers uneven. When you start to approach your marking, we're going to end it the same way by curving the zipper off to the edge and adding a nice tack stitch. The best thing to do is actually close the zipper shut to make sure everything lines up and is looking good. Moving on, open the zipper back up and place the panel off to the side. Grab your last two main panels and you're going to have a computer panel and a lining. Place the wrong sides together and stitch all the way around the outside edge, either serging or using a zigzag stitch. If you are using a zigzag stitch, make sure you're sewing directly on that edge and not going too far into the panel. After serging or zigzag stitching, make sure all the layers got sewn together, and what we're going to do is mark the centers on the side and the top edges for both sides. We're also going to do the same thing for the complete back side panel. Mark the centers on the top and the bottom. With the zipper at the top of the panel, place the lining layer to the laptop fabric layer. Pin both of these panels together, making sure all the layers are lined up, and that's the benefit of serging, is that it's easier to keep everything organized. And then go ahead and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the outside edge. These last couple of stitches when we're sewing everything together can get very tricky, so definitely just take your time, make sure all your measurements are correct, and do your best to work with your fabric. Pop the laptop layer out, flip it down so that the lining is facing up. Move the panel off to the side, grab your main back panel, place the two layers together with right sides of the side panels touching. For the best results, line up at your center points, pin the layers together, and we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the outside edge, just like we did in the previous step. With each new layer you add to the main construction, it's going to get a little bit more tricky. But again, with each one of these layers, it's really good practice, and you'll get better and better as you make more bags. After stitching the layers, we're going to snip the webbing ends flush with the seam allowance. Open the top zipper and flip the right side of the bag out. I like to double check all the layers to make sure everything got stitched together before I move on to the next step. Place the lining down with right sides pointing up, grab our complete main side panel, mark the centers on both sides, and then we're gonna place the side with one zipper on the back side panel. Line up the top and bottom centers on both of the side panels, add pins all the way around the outside edge, and again, we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around that outside edge. With each new layer, it adds more bulk and gives you less space to work with. So take your time, especially around those corners, and you're working with a lot of zippers. You want to make sure you're staying on those zippers and layers as you're sewing. Just like the previous step, we're going to flip the right sides out and check all the layers from the outside. Make sure nothing is popping out and all the layers look good. And this part is cool because you can actually start seeing the formation of the bag. After double checking, flip the lining back out, and we're going to add our front main panel. With the centers marked on the main panel, we're going to place the right sides together, pin the main side panel to the main front panel, making sure all the edges are even, and again, we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is the last big stitch, so just take your time, and it is the main front panel, so it's going to be the thing that's right on the front of the bag, so definitely make it count, take your time, and definitely make sure all the layers are staying lined up as you're sewing. Once you completed the stitch, we're going to take it to the bottom edge and snip the zippers flush with the side seam. Repeat this process for both of your zippers, and from here we're going to flip the right sides out and double check our work. The bag is not totally complete yet, so definitely double check to make sure all the layers got sewn together, because the next step is really going to permanently seal this bag together. I like to try all the zippers to make sure everything is still lined up, looking good, functioning good. And once I'm totally satisfied that all the layers are sewn together and all the zippers line up, I'm going to flip the wrong sides back out. And from here, I'm going to add my double fold bias tape to all the edges on the inside of the bag. You can skip this step, but I'm going to walk you through a few different methods on doing this. The first method is using a bias tape making kit, and this is where you make your own bias tape. It's super simple to do. You cut your bias tape strips, feed it through your folder, and press it as it's coming out your folder. And by picking this method, you get to choose the size and also the color of fabric to match your project. The second method is using a double fold bias tape binder. You install this to your machine and it gives you the ability to sew directly onto your garment. It's a very fast and effective technique. The third technique is using pre-made bias tape. This technique, you're very limited to colors, but it's easy to do. You just fold it over your edge and stitch it down. This is a great way to go if you don't have a lot of tools to work with. And I'm going to be stitching mine on using the double fold bias tape attachment. By far, this is one of the best techniques if you're planning on making a lot of bags, but feel free to use whatever method that works best for you. This bias tape gives strength and also a little bit of structure to those corners on the inside of the bag. So I highly recommend taking the time and doing it. From here, we're going to add our zipper pulls. And these pulls come in all different styles. These ones are super simple. You feed them through the end of the zipper and pull them tight. I really like adding these for functionality and just that nice little detail to really set your bag off. Like always, the last step is adding your branding. I add mine in different areas that I can clip things onto. I just use a little piece of branded leather and fasten it on with rivets. If you are struggling with this bag, don't worry, it just takes time and practice to really get it looking good, and just keep following the steps. You'll eventually come across a way that works for you, and you'll be able to apply that technique to each one of your bags or sewing projects in the future.
And there you have it, your expanding laptop backpack is complete. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hopefully your bags turned out awesome. If they didn't turn out great the first try, I promise you if you keep trying and you'll get better at sewing and your bags will start looking a lot better. Also, finding the right machines that works with what you're making is a real help. I started off with domestic machines, then I slowly started buying industrial machines, and the industrial machines kind of related to what I was making. So definitely buy your machines for what you're actually going to be making and set it up for that specific process. Like always, if you have any questions, definitely send them my way. But I'm going to keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.